some of the moments that I've had the good fortune to have had. So we'll see what we can pack into an hour, and after that, hopefully, just leave lots of times for question and answer. I thought I would begin with a short video, because picture's worth 1,000 words, and it captures a lot. It's just nice to have that video element of things. So I think it's a good way to start. And then what I'm going to do afterwards is, as I said, it covers most of the ground that I'm going to touch on, but a little bit more superficially. But then I'll just dive more deeply into all of that afterwards. So let me see if I can get this all started. Now, and I'm working from two computers here, so I'm going to have to try and keep both of them moving forward at the same time. So here we go, and hopefully the volume on this works.
Doctors Without Borders, also known internationally by our French name, Médecins Sans Frontières, or MSF, is an independent medical humanitarian organization. Founded in 1971, MSF won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1999. Today we have some 33,000 staff on the ground in roughly 70 countries. MSF provides life-saving medical care to those affected by war, natural disasters, disease outbreaks, systematic neglect or exclusion, and other crises. We work in accordance with international humanitarian law and medical ethics. We treat people based on medical needs alone, regardless of race, religion, or political affiliation. MSF is set up to respond to emergencies and provide free, high-quality medical care. Over the years, our logistical teams have developed ready-made kits to help us mobilize quickly. These kits contain the materials needed to fight a cholera outbreak or get a surgical program up and running. A kit could even contain a fully functioning inflatable operating theater. We have an extensive network of aid workers staffing projects all over the world, along with emergency experts ready to fly out at a moment's notice. Perhaps most importantly, the vast majority of MSF's funding comes from private donors, not governments. This is how we maintain financial independence and allows us to make rapid operational decisions based on the medical needs we see on the ground, not on political or funding considerations. At any given moment, MSF teams are treating patients in a range of emergencies. Nearly a third of MSF's projects are in conflict zones. Here, people are caught in the crossfire and cut off from healthcare services, unable to get the assistance they urgently need. Our teams work to establish safe spaces for patients and for medical personnel. Team leaders actively negotiate access to communities where the needs are greatest. They do this by communicating with all sides to a conflict and explaining MSF's guiding principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence, along with the healthcare services we offer. In many places, this allows MSF to work where other organizations can't. Even as fighting continues, our teams assist the wounded and others affected by war with a range of critical services, including surgery, emergency obstetrics, and maternity care. MSF also provides primary health care, vaccinations, mental health counseling, and more, adapting programs to people's health needs. When an earthquake, hurricane, or other natural disaster hits, experienced MSF staff evaluate the situation on the ground to identify the most urgent needs. At warehouses in logistical hubs around the world, teams assemble medicines and supplies and send them as quickly as possible. Staff in the disaster zone can then start treating the wounded and reinforcing battered medical systems. This might mean setting up an inflatable hospital for emergency surgeries, providing water and sanitation services, or running programs to prevent disease outbreaks where people are taking shelter. Conflicts, natural disasters, and other crises can drive people from their homes forcing them to flee unstable circumstances in search of safety. Too often they find more uncertainty and hardship, along with poor living conditions where public services are scarce. Here, MSF responds to the particular health needs of displaced people by treating illnesses and injuries, preventing disease outbreaks, battling malnutrition, and ensuring access to maternal and pediatric care. In some cases, teams also provide water and sanitation services or distribute essential everyday items like soap, cooking oil, and shelter materials. Women and children are particularly vulnerable to sexual violence in overcrowded camps or wherever law and order have broken down. MSF provides medical and mental health care for survivors of sexual violence and does community outreach to let people know that free, confidential treatment is available and that survivors should come in for care as quickly as possible. The majority of our patients are women and children, and we offer specialized care to attend to their specific needs, particularly around maternal health and childbirth. In many MSF projects, we offer comprehensive care for mothers and babies. This includes prenatal, postnatal, and newborn care, along with emergency care for complications from deliveries, such as obstructed labor and postpartum hemorrhage. Malaria, cholera, and measles are just some of the diseases MSF tackles. Our epidemiologists track outbreaks, while other medical staff treat the sick and launch prevention efforts like vaccination campaigns. Community outreach teams let people know how to identify and halt the spread of the disease while we test for new cases. In 2014 and 15, MSF took the lead in responding to the massive Ebola outbreak that struck West Africa, treating more than 5,000 people and repeatedly calling on the international community to do more to help. Starting in the year 2000, MSF began treating people with HIV and AIDS. We now provide antiretroviral treatment to more than 341,000 people in 20 countries. MSF also runs a number of programs for those with tuberculosis and drug-resistant TB, as well as dangerous HIV-TB co-infections. For MSF, it's not enough to just provide medical services. We also speak out about what's happening to people. We advocate for our patients in meetings and in statements directed to governments and to the international community, as well as through the media and other platforms. The message is always the same. People at risk should be able to access health care, and medical workers, even in active conflict zones, must be allowed to provide it according to the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law. MSF also believes that life-saving medicines and vaccines must be affordable and accessible to the people who need them most. MSF works with some of the most vulnerable people on the planet, and we're often frustrated by both the high cost of medicines and the lack of diagnostic tools and treatments available in some countries. MSF's Access campaign pushes governments and the pharmaceutical industry to direct research and development efforts toward making affordable products for the kinds of diseases our patients face, including potentially fatal ones, such as tuberculosis, and neglected diseases like Kala-Azar. MSF conducts research to document our efforts to adapt and optimize care in logistically challenging settings where resources are limited. Given our reach as an organization and the places where we work, we can often gather insights and data that few others can. By publishing our findings in peer-reviewed medical journals, we share this work with the medical humanitarian community so that other organizations and vulnerable populations can benefit from our on-the-ground experience. In recent years, MSF research has shown innovative and successful new ways to treat patients. We've demonstrated more effective treatment of severely malnourished children in India, provided integrated community-based care for HIV and TB patients in Swaziland, and expanded the use of vaccinations against tetanus, cholera, and other potentially fatal diseases for children living in refugee camps. MSF strives to be transparent and accountable for our work. This means publishing critical reviews of our programs, information about our spending, and accounts of what's worked and what needs to improve in our medical programs. Accountability is one of our core principles, something we know is connected to everything else we do. We're grateful for the support we've received from donors around the world, so we provide as much information about our work as we can through various platforms, including regular donor communications, the news media, social media, and public events. The ongoing support of our donors, together with the profound commitment of our aid workers, will allow MSF to provide independent and impartial assistance to people in crises for a long time to come. We know that the future holds many challenges for people around the world, but we also know what's possible when we go where we're most needed with the materials we need to deliver life-saving medical care.
Great. Bring that back up there. Okay. Yeah, so, as I said, pictures, worth a 1,000 words. So this just, gives a quick snapshot overview of what the organization's all about, where we work, what we do, that kind of thing. And what I wanted to do now was to start to dive into some of these elements a little bit more, just, interspersing, as I said, with a little bit of my own experiences. So as the video mentioned, MSF, or it's an international medical humanitarian organization. It was founded in 1971 by a group of French doctors and reporters who were working for the International Red Cross in the Biafra region of Nigeria. There was a massive famine going on at the time. Much of that was related to, obviously, the conflict that was raging within that region as well. Unfortunately, those physicians started to become very disillusioned because the International Red Cross was not going to cross the border into the Biafra region without the express consent of the Nigerian authorities. So those physicians quit. They went back to France, and that's when the organization was born. And the name, Doctors Without Borders, grew out of the experience of radically crossing borders in the name of humanitarian action. And the new organization was based on the humanitarian principles of impartiality and neutrality and independence, as well as medical ethics. MSF specifically works in the direct provision of medical care to people in situations of crisis. We attempt to save lives, alleviate suffering, and restore human dignity. There's certainly times when MSF is going to speak out publicly in an effort to bring attention to forgotten or neglected crises, especially when we just get the sense that enough is enough. And over the last 46 years, since it's been around, MSF has grown into an organization with now over, like they were saying, 33,000, I think it's close to 35,000 staff working in over 70 countries at this point. There's an annual operational budget of 1.5 billion US. So, from the early days of those small group of physicians and reporters who could, hardly scratch together a couple of centimes in their pocket, it's been an unbelievable trajectory. In 1999, MSF was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, specifically because of our model of humanitarian assistance, which is not just the actual direct provision of medical care, but it's that whole speaking out element. What I want to do now is just to highlight a little bit more those humanitarian principles that MSF bases its work on, in large part because this is a key component of our overall identity. So, starting off with impartiality, which is essentially, it's one of the fundamental humanitarian principles, and it refers to the concept of prioritizing assistance based on need and proportionality rather than nationality or race or religion. So it's somewhat akin to triage. For me, I work in the emergency department, and that's how we do. We just triage people based on need. But in the end, if we cannot carry out our work freely, assessing and treating based on need, we will certainly leave the country. The this is, as I said, I just want to give you a few examples of some of the places that I've been and some of the experiences that I had, just to try and flesh out a little bit of this as well. This is a picture in South Sudan. I was working in a small town called Akobo. This is back in 2001. And you can see all the huts scattered around. And this is very similar. It's not the actual, I couldn't get an aerial photo like this, but it's very similar to the kind of location that our village and our hospital was located in. So the country was certainly suffering from a civil war that had been going on for decades. And our hospital was the only one in the entire region. It was packed, and truly, from a medical perspective, it was fascinating. There was this one day I remember when there was this military person came into the hospital. He was carrying his daughter. Truthfully, he's probably the healthiest looking, baby girl that I had seen ever in South Sudan. He was flanked by two other soldiers, both of them carrying weapons, Kalashnikovs. And this is my first mission. I started to get into an argument with this gentleman that he needed his guards to leave the hospital. We have a very strict no guns policy on every single vehicle and structure we work in. So this was, certainly not acceptable. Like I said, it's my first mission, very inexperienced at the time. But I also said that, look, I understand that your daughter's unwell. She needs to be seen. But we have a system where we're going to be seeing people, based on their needs. And if I can't get to her right now, well, I can't get to her right now. That's just all the way it works. And, so for the next 10, 15 minutes, the arguments got a little bit louder, a little bit louder, a little bit louder. And anyway, I kind of noticed that a number of my other South Sudanese staff were kind of gathering just in my vision, just on the other side of all of this. And they started to kind of wave at me just to calm down a little bit. And as I said, my first mission, a bit inexperienced. So anyway, one of them took me aside at one point and explained to me that this was the commander of the third largest rebel group operating in South Sudan. I didn't know that. I just, like I said, a little bit wet behind the ears, and this is how I saw things. So anyway, I felt a little bit nervous, at this point, but, I returned for, okay, what kind of story can I, dream up to kind of make this go in a slightly better way? And I was thinking, well, if I was in my emergency department in Canada and our prime minister showed up, I would still, make sure that individual was just triaged according to need. And anyway, somehow he kind of bought that story, at the moment. And yeah, maybe I stretched the truth a little bit, but anyway, triaging based on need is certainly essential. Neutrality. So MSF does not take sides in a conflict. And this becomes a bit difficult when we can't physically access both sides of a conflict to physically display our neutrality. And that matters. This is a time when I was working in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is back in 2003. I was in a small town called Baraka. It's on the shores of Lake Tanganyika. Anyway, very similar situation in the sense that a long-standing civil war was going on. This one had been sparked by the Rwandan genocide that had devastated the region. No healthcare for miles. And one night we received a group of about 20 or so war-wounded soldiers. There had been some fighting. Front line was not too far from the town. They arrived, varying wounds, some of them significant chest wounds, some of them more superficial, just extremity wounds. The nurses, myself, we just kind of patched them up. We did what we could. We had stitches and gauze and antiseptic. We were not surgeons. We did not have surgical capacity at the time. We did what we could. And when we left, we came back the next morning, most of them had actually left, or at least the ones who could walk. But shortly thereafter, we actually received a phone call from our base in neighboring Burundi, in Bujumbura, that they had received a phone call from one of our, sort of trusted locals that our hospital in Baraka was being perceived as non-neutral. And that was specifically because of all the soldiers that showed up that night before were all from the one side of the fighting. And this was a problem for us. So we had some quick team discussion, and what we decided to do, in large part because from a medical needs perspective, we certainly could not address the patients who were remaining. We had to transfer them off to somewhere. There happened to be further up the lake, a war-wounded hospital run by the International Red Cross. So we found a pickup truck, whatever we could, just to load all of these wounded soldiers and take them up the road along the lake. It was a dangerous journey. You can see the boat there in the photo. we used that boat to get down the lake because the road was too dangerous, too much in terms of all the front lines going on. So, but we had no other choice. So we sent the soldiers in that pickup truck up the road, very hot, midday, a lot of sun. But, for the most part, it seemed like the best way to go at the time. And it certainly fixed our problems around their medical care and the issue of neutrality. But we also thought about it a bit more later on that day. And that whole issue of the perception of neutrality, we started thinking, what else can we do? And that boat that we had to bring us originally down to start this project was not being used. It was sitting out there in the middle of the bay. So across the bay was this little peninsula of land called the Ubwari Peninsula. And again, that was on the other side of the front lines, which always shifted in this region. And we kind of came up with the idea that, why don't we start running mobile boat clinics across the bay to that peninsula? We'll just pick a different village each week and just basically set up a primary healthcare clinic on that day to try and access some of the people, and obviously the soldiers as well, living on the other side of the front line. So anyway, in the end, those mobile clinics were incredible because as soon as we pulled up on the beach, it was just packed. And we walked into the village, just found where can we set things up, because we need to create a little bit of organization and order to what we were doing. And of course, the village chiefs were always the first ones, who we had to see. But it was a fascinating experience, and again, specifically just trying to look at that whole issue of neutrality. So next principle I wanted to talk about briefly is just independence. And so this specifically refers to freedom from political, religious, economic powers. And the idea is that, in large part for us, this is related to our financial independence. And we're unbelievably fortunate that we have the vast majority of our income coming from private donors. And therefore, we are able to make our own decisions on where we want to work and what projects we want to set up. We're not dictated to by local governments, by international organizations. We go in, we do a needs assessment, we talk to the community, we figure out what are the greatest needs in this area, and that's what we then attempt to respond to if it happens to coincide with what our expertise is. So we're very fortunate to be able to be an independent humanitarian organization, because that's certainly not common these days. I just want to touch on medical ethics. So again, one of those key elements that underpins, who we are and what we do. There's the standard bits, around medical ethics, like autonomy and, the patients making decisions for themselves with information, beneficence, do no harm, distributive justice, all of the things along that line are the things that we try and aspire to in the work that we do. We're also trying to push it a bit more into things like confidentiality and informed consent. And when you're dealing with, different languages and so on and so forth, and, some of these things become quite difficult, but certainly we're giving it a shot. But in a general sense, ethics is certainly something that we're attempting to inform the work that we do a lot more. There was, an example that I wanted to go over. This is a couple of years ago in Myanmar. We had a massive HIV program going on and looking after tens of thousands of patients with AIDS, providing them antiretroviral medications, life-saving medications for the HIV virus with AIDS. Huge cohort of patients that we had. And a couple of years ago, the WHO, the World Health Organization, decided that and I think it's a good idea, to change the threshold of when to start the antiretroviral treatment for the various patients with HIV and AIDS. And on the one hand, great. On the other hand, for us, it dramatically increased the numbers of people, HIV positive patients, who would then be able to access our clinic for antiretroviral medications. And we just did not have enough medication at all, not even close. And at this point, so now we've got many, many, many more people, and our teams, just a few people on the ground there, are now having to start to make decisions because we don't have enough medication to go around to all these people showing up, gradually over the course of 1 to 2 to 3 months. They had to start making decisions on, so who do we treat? Because we could potentially treat everybody. And it became very difficult because there were patients who meet the criteria for treatment. And if they were in the West, in Canada, yes, they would certainly be on antiretroviral therapy. But there, we didn't have enough drugs. We couldn't get them in. So they had to make decisions on who we're going to treat and who we're not going to treat. Again, you look at impartiality, you treat the sickest, but the difficulty is that a month later, 2 months later, 3 months later, you're potentially going to have the people who you've turned away coming back more sick, at which point, yes, maybe we'll treat them at that point. But 3 months before, had we been able to start treating them, they wouldn't have gotten there. So these are some of the dilemmas that our teams face. There was another situation in the West African Ebola outbreak in 2014 in Liberia. So, Guinea and Sierra Leone and Liberia were the three countries that were the hardest hit. So in Liberia, in the capital of Monrovia, is where we actually had our largest Ebola treatment center set up. Massive center. And it got so full, and the numbers of patients in that city were so immense that the center itself was only able to open its doors to admit new patients for 1 hour a day. And during that single hour, what they had to do, the teams, had to look at who was there and choose who they're going to admit into the hospital in the sense of who might live, because we really had no treatment, and who was certainly going to die. And those are the decisions that the teams were having to make. Not easy decisions. And that's where the whole issue of medical ethics starts to come in, because we try and bring people in to help the teams in these kinds of situations, these ethically challenging situations, to help them get through this. And yet, at the end of the day, I certainly don't think it's enough. These situations, in my opinion, are certainly overwhelming in the midst of that kind of suffering. Kind of shifting tack a little bit, I wanted to talk about where MSF works. So, as the video was saying, we work in 71 countries worldwide. I think there's about 460, give or take, projects that we've got across those countries. And, even these numbers change pretty frequently. And even in this instance, there's some that are missing: Libya, Mexico, Angola, just looking at the map here, Mexico, we've got a lot of projects in there. So things are always shifting. Most of our work tends to be in sub-Saharan Africa. Probably about 60% of all of our projects, growing certainly in the Middle East, just owing to all the conflict that's going on there. Certainly, we've got some projects in Latin America, and then as well even some in Europe. The kinds of locations that we work, as the video is mentioning, probably about 50% of our overall programs are in situations of conflict. And that doesn't have to be like acute hot conflict where the bullets are flying. It can also be, just near post-conflict, or sometimes there's a bit of stabilization going on, or there's a truce, so things along those lines. But certainly many of these settings are in the headlines: Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, the ones that we hear, certainly a lot about. But many are not, and yet they're also equally horrific. Yemen, Central African Republic, Somalia, and again, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which seems to be heading in very much the wrong direction from an acute conflict perspective. The ones that we don't hear so much about are we've started just to coin them neglected and forgotten crises, and try and do what we can to speak out about what's going on in those areas. So from an armed conflict context perspective, it's certainly not just related to treating war-wounded soldiers, like I was mentioning in that one experience I had in Eastern Congo, with surgery and so on. Truthfully, most of what we provide in these settings is all just basic healthcare to people who are displaced by violence. And in a sense, the healthcare system has been so damaged, or potentially even absolutely non-existent, because there's just no Ministry of Health going on. So that's where we come in to try and work. So, as I said, armed conflict certainly accounts for the majority of where we go. I was talking earlier, about that experience in South Sudan. This was my first day. So I showed up to the project, flown in. I couldn't see the landing strip until we were like 5 feet off the ground, and got off the plane and got a quick tour of the compound where we were living. And truthfully, looking at the huts, it was like, wow, it's kind of quaint. And I ended up sharing, I had a little hut, so we call it tukul, all to myself. And there was a large iguana that I was actually sharing it with, because I found it later, sitting in the plastic sheeting that was lining the inside of my roof, an Inder Ethel, for no particular reason. But interestingly, you can see the little path there. And so I was continuing down this path, and I ran into something around the corner that was a bit unique. I thought, truthfully, first mission, first day, wet behind the ears. I thought this is a hot tub. I was going, wow, that's great. It's kind of like this really about lifestyle and so on. And well, actually, these are bomb shelters. So again, things that you just learn. I had absolutely no idea what was going on. Thankfully, we extremely rarely had to use them. And in fact, they were more dangerous just to walk into because of all the snakes that would end up, inside them if they weren't cleaned regularly. So, shifting, so armed conflict, a lot of our programming. Epidemic response is also a huge reason of why MSF tends to start some projects. There's a lot of things, cholera, measles, meningitis, bloody diarrhea like Shigella, hepatitis E, of course, Ebola, as we've been talking about. But we're also starting to see, just because, again, the breakdown of healthcare systems in Bangladesh with that massive influx of the Rohingya population from Myanmar, we've now got a diphtheria outbreak. Again, completely vaccine preventable. And we haven't had to deal with something like diphtheria, even on an individual patient perspective. And now we've got like hundreds of patients with diphtheria. So it's from a medical perspective, it's fascinating. But, from an overall public health perspective, it's just so unbelievable how some of these things are coming back. As I said, it's all vaccine preventable. I've worked in, a number of different epidemic settings, hepatitis E and cholera and measles, carried a lot of vaccination campaigns. But I remember there was one thing that caught me a little bit by surprise when I started working my first cholera response, cholera watery diarrhea, acute watery diarrhea. And the beds, it's just like a wooden frame, and they take the plastic sheet and they just put it over and they cut out a small hole. It's kind of like the size of a standard bucket right in the middle of it. Like, you missed a spot. Why do you have this? And kind of makes sense. The patients are so dehydrated with cholera because the diarrhea is so incessant. They're just lying flat on their back, and that's where the bum goes. You put a bucket underneath, and that's how things just get dealt with in some of these kinds of epidemics. So again, some of the things that that you end up seeing, that you learn about. I worked in Sierra Leone in the West African Ebola outbreak. This was back in 2014. It was interesting because back in that first mission of mine in South Sudan, there was a young girl that I looked after who very emaciated, very thin. She's only about 7 years of age, but she was bleeding a lot from her nose. Then she started vomiting up blood, and she had a fever. And at the time, again, my first mission, the case definition that we have for viral hemorrhagic fever, and Ebola is one of those, and Ebola had been in that region of South Sudan about 20-ish years before I was working there. So it was somehow present. So she actually fit the case definition for viral hemorrhagic fever with the possibility of Ebola. And here I am for his mission. Oh my gosh, should I be calling the WHO? And I was the only physician there. There was a catchment of probably about 1 million people, in the entire area. And I'm like, what the heck do I do? So anyway, just by chance, we happened to have some reassuring blood work that, got faxed to us from Nairobi in Kenya that same day when I was really worrying about what to do, looking it up in textbooks, how to deal with Ebola. And it turns out that she had a different illness, a parasitic illness called leishmaniasis, which explained all of her symptoms. We put her on treatment. 2 weeks later, she was up and walking. It was incredible. But it's a little bit scary. But then flash forward 13 years, and here I am in West Africa, actually surrounded by Ebola. The town that I was working in was a place called Kailahun in the eastern part of Sierra Leone. And when I arrived there in this Ebola treatment center, there was about 80 patients, all confirmed positive with Ebola. The place was hopping. It was mad. And, just some of there's so many memories that I have of that mission. One of them certainly was, even before I left, one of the things that you have to do or have to not do is to touch your face because it's a well-known risk for actually the staff contracting the viral illness. And so I was practicing for like a month, beforehand, don't touch your face, don't touch your face. And of course, I was failing like every day. And even on the plane ride there, there I was, it's like, man, I got to stop that because, things are certainly going to be a little bit problematic pretty darn soon. And so I would challenge all you guys, while you're here for the next little while, see if you can like just notice if you touch your face. It was pretty hard. It was crazy. There was also a lot of other scares. There were times when, we would finish. You can see in here where we're getting undressed and getting all washed down with chlorine. And, at one point taking off my gloves and going, whoa, that's a whole lot of skin that I see exposed right there. So these are the kinds of things that started to make us anxious. And, at one point when I got all of the clothing off and was just going to wash my hands one further time, hands are all pruny and wet and so on. And the spigot on this big drum of chlorine solution was a bit tight, and my finger just got the skin sheared off of it. And I sat there looking at my fingers. It starts to bleed and bleed and bleed. And I'm going, oh, this is really bad. Because here you are, you're surrounded by the virus. But we also knew, if there's no contaminated fluid getting onto broken skin, you're not going to pick up the virus. But it didn't still curtail all of our anxiety around this. So it was a fascinating time to work, again, from a medical perspective, but just the tragedy that was unfolding around us was immense. So certainly one of my most intense missions, but extremely gratifying just to be there to try and help. Population displacement. So again, another area. Most of the time, population displacement just related to conflict situations, natural disasters, and so on. A lot of the work that we do, ends up, related to populations who have been pushed for whatever reason. Again, like I mentioned, one of the most recent huge population shifts has been the Rohingya population out of Myanmar, into Bangladesh, and still, as I mentioned, in the Congo, things seem to be just very much heading in the wrong direction. It's kind of hard to tell, but all that white line in the middle, that's a refugee camp that I worked at in eastern Chad for the Darfur refugees who had crossed out from Sudan. This is back, I think, in roughly 2004. The camp, we only had enough water, very arid area. We only had enough water for 25,000 people, sort of the rough estimates. And there was a minimum 35,000 people who basically showed up and just ended up there. And we knew that, if we don't do something about this in the long run, we're going to be getting into serious problems from a water shortage perspective. So one of the challenges in this specific experience was trying to move 25,000 people in an orderly fashion to a different location where we had enough water to supply that volume of people. So while we were there, we were just looking after all the healthcare needs, primary healthcare, secondary healthcare, really sick people, as well as all the malnutrition and nutritional requirements, and all the vaccination campaigns. We had an outbreak of hepatitis E, one of those things like, I've never seen hepatitis E, but here we had an outbreak going on in the middle of the refugee camp. We worked with a lot of other organizations. CARE was overseeing the overall management. Oxfam was looking after all the water supply and the sanitation issues. And so it was fascinating to be able to work with a bunch of other organizations in such a small captive location. But there were certainly some challenging moments. I remember there was one time here, we never had enough food, again, because the numbers kept growing and growing and growing. And the World Food Program was tasked with bringing in all the food. And there definitely was not enough, for understandable and some completely not understandable reasons. But nevertheless, that was the reality. And of course, there comes a time when the refugee population they've had enough, or they actually haven't had enough. I guess that's why they got so angry. And so there were riots that were beginning. And I remember there was this one time we were just out getting some supplies and bringing them back to our health clinic in the middle of this massive refugee camp. And all of a sudden this riot just explodes around us. And, we're just kind of noticing there's a few more people and a few more people and a few more people. And then we're going slower and slower and slower in our vehicle. And then all of a sudden, people are starting to yell and move quickly and heading off in this direction. And we're in this car. And it started to get quite scary for us. But one of the things that happened, which I found fascinating, because we'd been there for, probably about 2 to 3 months, doing the best thing that we possibly could in terms of providing healthcare and treating all the malnourished children in particular. So when people got a sense of, because the shoulders of this, just thousands of people, right up against our vehicle, as I said, it was a bit scary for us in the car. Some people started to notice who we were. And all of a sudden, this gap opens up in the people, and people just started waving us saying, please go that way. We're going this way because we're pissed. But please, we want you guys to be safe and move over that way. So it's fascinating, just that whole community acceptance side of things. Because often it can head sort of in the opposite direction. I remember there was another time when there was an accidental discharge of a patient who I thought had meningitis, life-threatening illness. And so in a camp of 35,000 people, trying to find one person in a tent. Anyway, we did. Sometimes it's nice when things are rather a little bit orderly, at least. But what they call the bush telegraph. When you start to ask a little bit of people, yep, you want to go over to this spot, and you ask somebody over there, yep, you're going to go over in that direction. You go over there. Okay, yeah, they're just 3 tents down, and it's like, wow, how does this work? Anyway, it's just fascinating some of the moments that we had. Natural disasters, another area. Like, truthfully, this doesn't account for a huge amount of what we do, because one of the difficulties with natural disasters, if you're not already there in the location, especially for the big acute things like earthquakes and tsunamis and so on, most of it ends up just being search and rescue and the acute surgery. And if you're not there, it's really hard to arrive and get things set up all that quickly. But sometimes we are. In Haiti, we actually, when the earthquake happened in 2010, we'd already been there for years and years and years, and we had big hospital projects set up, and then the earthquake happens, and we were able to respond immediately to what was going on as we brought in more surgical hospitals to deal with all the surgical interventions that were needed. So just again looking at the kinds of programs. So primary healthcare is still the backbone of what we do. The usual suspects of malaria, respiratory illnesses, the pneumonias and so on, and diarrhea, sort of like still, 3 of the most common things that we'll end up, having to address. And again, like the video had mentioned, still maternal and child. The vast majority of our patients are under the age of 15 and usually under the age of 5. The kinds of work that, a physician like myself would do in a primary healthcare project is it's more supervisory, because we've got a lot of local nurses. There's usually language issues, that we need to work through the local staff to figure out, A, what's going on, and B, how do we deal with it. So it's more of a supervisory and a supply and a stocking thing. But as I said, primary healthcare is still, because I think like last year, 2016, there was close to 10 million patient consultations, that we had globally with all of this. This was an example when I was working in Burundi, again, Central Africa. So this is the eastern part of the country, an area called the Moso Valley, a bit of a conflict going on with the Burundian government. And so we were based out of a small town called Ruigi. And in this Moso Valley, which was controlled by the rebels, we wanted to get in there to supply and support the 8 healthcare centers that were there. And the military kept saying, no, we can't let you in. It's too unsafe. So finally we said, the hell with it, we're just going to do it. So we went in, and of course it's just fine. But you've got to stop, every moment you can, just to explain who you are and what you're doing. And the more times that you do that, the more you get the chance to get to know the people and start to get to know some of the power, if you will, in the valley area with the rebels, and the acceptance just starts to grow. So it was interesting getting in there. When we would see sicker patients in these health clinics, we would then bring them out, because the only hospital nearby was where we were based out of, in that town called Ruigi. And we weren't intending at all to work in that hospital. But now we're bringing these patients from this valley into this hospital in this town. And we're also looking at, well, what's the healthcare like in this hospital? And, it was certainly from our perspective, not what we would want in terms of what we were hoping for these patients to be treated with. So this got into a bit of the mission creep problem for us, is that, well, we started to work a little bit in the hospital. Most of the patients that we're bringing out are children, so we'll support the pediatrics ward. But then, in terms of overall supply for the hospital, it's a problem. And so all the other wards are raiding the pediatrics ward for drugs and supplies. So we then took over the pharmacy, and occasionally, there's the need for operations. We started to support the operating theaters. And so we're trying to, it's just ward after ward after ward. And then it was overall salaries, because that's why, people weren't showing up for work in the other areas. When we needed an operation, there was nobody to do it because they weren't getting salaries paid. So we took over the salary. This whole mission creep was just one of those challenges that we ended up facing. So it gets to the point where you've got to make the bigger decision of, should we be there or not? So again, just some of the, the difficulties that we have. So primary healthcare and hospital support, secondary levels of healthcare. To me, from a medical perspective, this is certainly some of the more interesting work. And, we either support, the structures that are already in place. Rarely we'll end up building a brand new hospital from scratch. That's one of the things that we did, a permanent hospital actually in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, just following the earthquake, just because the need was there. Interestingly, this ward actually looks really clean. That's not so normal. This is, back to that first mission that I was at in South Sudan, the ward was just way too hot. So, more or less all the patients that had the chance to get outside would get outside. So here we are just looking after, a patient with meningitis, out under the tree, finding what little bit of shade you could in the area. And this is, again, when we were working in that town in Baraka in Eastern Congo, I looked after the pediatrics ward, and, in the high season, the rainy season with lots and lots of malaria, you'd end up having at least 2 patients per bed. And after you finish rounding, you just go from bed to bed to bed to bed, and we had about 30 or so beds in this room. You finish the full circle, you get to bed number 30, and then you go back to bed 1 again. Because now you've got a whole bunch of new patients. And so it's just one of those things. You got pretty tired, and burnout was certainly a bit of an issue for us. Surgery, significant for, obvious reasons in a variety of projects, and especially in terms of obstetrical surgery, we're trying to expand the kinds of services that we offer. Because again, as the video is mentioning, maternal child health, obstetrical complications, tend to be one of the leading, causes of death in the maternal population. We're getting into more advanced surgery as well, just with so many victims of war and landmines, reconstruction and so on, from a plastics or an orthopedic perspective. So a lot of that, is starting to expand, with our programming. Malnutrition, another big reason for, setting up, different programs. Again, typically, a man-made problem, conflict related, in terms of why, malnutrition, creeps in. So this is one of the areas where, again, with what's on offer in terms of what, food products we can use to treat the malnourished children primarily, sometimes it just doesn't work. I remember, all these corn soya blends, things that just tasted like, it was just chalky gruel. When I was working in South Sudan, that's what we started to eat. And, so ultimately there came the time where we need something that's a bit more palatable, equally nutritious to deal with the malnutrition, but a heck of a lot more palatable. So we just started working with different organizations to create new products. And, one of them was something called Plumpy Nuts, peanut-based blend of calories and vitamins and so on that is just, kids love it. And we got into the point where now we don't actually have to admit all these severely malnourished kids, because, the moms will just bring them back on a daily or weekly basis, and we'll just give them, with clear instructions, how much Plum Peanut packages to consume. And so just trying to push the envelope on how can we better look after, these massive, tens of thousands of malnourished children. And this photo is just, a way to screen for malnutrition. It's called a MUAC, or MUAC, middle upper arm circumference. So you just slip it over and test, and it just gives you a quick and dirty way to just to do some of the nutritional screening on children before you more formally measure their weight and their height and so on. This is just a photo. So again, that whole South Sudan mission was fascinating for me. So here we had set up a nutritional survey, just using the river system in a boat, and so here we are, got all our tables, and of course the whole herd of cattle just moved right through the middle of where we were trying to get everything started. So just some of the local challenges that you have to deal with. Vaccination campaigns, again, just a critical element of what we do, whether it's, just the whole preferably proactive, the whole, UNICEF EPI campaigns or expanded program of immunization, or the reactive, if you've got meningitis outbreaks or measles outbreaks where you're just going to get in and try and prevent the mortality, in those settings, getting into some of the reactive campaigns where you could be vaccinating hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in a several month-long period of time. So the logistics of this is incredible to figure out how do you do this. And obviously, historically, a lot of these vaccines have been requiring a cold chain. And working in some of the hottest climates on Earth, trying to maintain that cold chain is extremely difficult. So, we're trying to push the envelope. The video talked about operational research, just trying to find some more heat-stable vaccines that, that we can just give orally, rather than cold chain requiring injections. So again, just some of the work that's going on, and this is again just using the river systems. We did this is a measles vaccination campaign. This one unfortunately didn't work all that well. One of the things I found fascinating with this was that we would just stop the boat, get out, set up our table, and like looking around, I don't see anybody. Like it just seems so isolated, so remote. And within 30 to 45 minutes, now there's like 40 children all around us. Crazy thing, there's no adults. Because they're all working. So what would happen is that the child would come, get vaccinated, an injection. How does this happen? Child would come, get vaccinated with a needle, and then would leave and come back with another child or another 2 children. So I'm like, how does this work? My kids certainly wouldn't do that. And a lot of it just had to do with little orange caps that were on the tops of the vaccine ampules. We would just give them to them. And they loved it. So they all kept coming back and I have another injection. So it was, again, just some of those moments that you remember. So most of our programming is what we call horizontal, where we just cover in general the needs, primary healthcare, secondary healthcare, hospital-based stuff. But again, just addressing the needs, treat who you meet. But we also have some programs that are related to what we call vertical programming. And a lot of this is just if that need or that specific illness is so off the charts, it's something that we might consider addressing alone in a silo approach. So HIV, is certainly something, especially to start to cut our teeth to figure out how do we deal with these volumes of people, with a complicated illness in a setting that is extremely, either insecure, unstable, and very remote. So we end up doing a lot of learning to try and figure out how do we do this. So that's where we get into some of these vertical programs. The next one that we've gotten into, with, as the video mentioned, drug-resistant tuberculosis, a lot of tuberculosis, and again, which is with the HIV globally, it's just there's a resurgence of TB. And the problem is that a lot of the TB is now becoming drug-resistant or extremely drug-resistant. And so figuring out how to address drug resistant and extreme drug resistance in tuberculosis is a huge challenge, because otherwise you're looking at 18 months of treatment that often just burns out the ears. So we're even getting into the point where we're not doing drug development ourselves, but we're supporting new drug development to try and find shorter, less side effect treatment regimens for things like drug resistant TB, because we end up seeing a lot of this in the places where we work. There's what else to comment on? Some of the other vertical programs, tropical diseases, things that you may or may never have heard of, Kala-Azar and Leishmaniasis and trypanosomiasis, and these are some of the things that we've never heard of them because, well, they're just in countries where they're neglected and by the pharmaceutical industry, big pharma, and so on. So we end up trying to find a lot of these patients. To try and then also at the same time, not only find them, but then come up with therapies that are not so toxic. So not so easy. So this is, where we're trying to do a lot of research and learning with some of the vertical programming that we've got. I'm just going to touch on this for a moment. So beyond saving lives, beyond relieving suffering, which as a physician is pretty obvious for me how to do that. But the story that I want to mention to you guys, it had a huge impact on me. So remember I was talking about that group of war wounded soldiers, in Eastern Congo, and a bunch of them came in, we patched them up, and the next morning most had gone, and the ones who were left, we had that issue of neutrality, put them on a pickup truck. I watched them go, I waved, and so I was walking back into the hospital, and I turned and I noticed there was a group of about 25 women who were sitting patiently under a tree over in one corner of the hospital. And one of them came up to me and asked if our hospital could treat them. And she said they'd all been raped. And for me, having never addressed the issue of sexual violence in war before, I suddenly felt overwhelmed completely. Of course we would help. I was saying, and as with the war wounded soldiers, we weren't really set up to offer the appropriate assistance for this either. And so that first afternoon, with this group of 25 women, it was so disorganized, but it didn't really seem to matter to the women that afternoon. They had come to the hospital often from 20 or 30 kilometers away and were accepting of whatever we could offer. And I found the most private place that I could, and I began listening to their stories, each one, more horrific than the last, one after another. None of the rapes were recent, some having happened several years beforehand. And as they recounted their personal experience, the women, they remained so stoic, expressing almost no emotion. And as that first afternoon drew on, I quickly realized there was no way I was going to be able to assess them all that day. And it also became clear that I had to finish at a time where they could walk home at night. It was dangerous to be a woman walking alone at night in Baraka. And so the local women's group who had helped organize all of this, they quickly gave out some appointments to the women that I could not assess that day. And even though they lived many kilometers away, I was assured that they would return. And I felt guilty for not being able to see them all that day, and the need for some of them to have to walk again such a long distance. But the women's group, they thanked us for what we'd done that afternoon and asked if we'd be able to see more of the women in the area who had been raped. And I asked how many, and she told me 150. And in the end, we developed a program of both medical and psychosocial support for these victims of sexual violence in the hospital. And over the next 6 months, we evaluated and treated over 500 women, as well as a significant number of men, some of them as young as 9, most getting into the ages of even close to 60. All had endured sexual violence by rebel soldiers. And truthfully, this long afterwards, there's generally little that we could do medically, and the chance of making a meaningful impact psychologically was also slim, given the very limited interventions that we offer. But what we did do was give them a chance to be heard. And it might not seem like much, but I do believe that it mattered. And it was here that I finally began to understand what had for a long time been a mystery to me. And that was the concept of restoring dignity as a humanitarian act. The purpose of humanitarian action is to save lives, alleviate suffering, and restore human dignity. And enacting this requires reaching out to our fellow human beings who find themselves in the most difficult of circumstances. And as a physician, for sure, I understood how to save lives and physically alleviate suffering. It was less clear what restoring human dignity meant. And yet, in the end, it may well be that this is the most powerful of services that we can offer in humanitarian assistance. Too often, we cannot save a life or turn back the clock of an illness or adequately relieve someone's pain. But through solidarity in our presence and individual actions guided by empathy, we can always provide at least a moment of human dignity in the lives of people in crisis, people who through conflict or displacement or disease have lost everything, or even everyone. And as stated by Dr. James Orbinski, a Canadian physician, when accepting the Nobel Peace Prize in 1999 on behalf of MSF, humanitarian action aims to build spaces of normalcy in the midst of what is profoundly abnormal. So I'm going to turn now and just finish off with some things that are a bit lighter, because humanitarian, the work that we do is certainly heavy. Many times, heartwarming, but way too often, absolutely heartbreaking. So logistics. I figured this is a great way to shift the discussion. So I would argue logistics is the greatest reason for our success. It's related to everything that we do that's non-medical. So it all depends on good logistics, the construction, communications, the energy supplies that we have, vehicle maintenance, having vehicles at all, the supply chains. And at least half of our teams, as I said, are non-medical, dealing with all of this admin and logistical support. And I would argue that, even though as a physician in this organization, I think that our medical care and our medical programming is pretty good, I would actually argue that there's lots of other organizations that, do it as well, or maybe in some ways even better than we do. But I would argue that our logistics is second to none, except for some of the world's larger militaries. So the whole thing that I wanted to mention with this is that it's extremely costly, but the reason that we're able to maintain such a high quality and a high level of logistical support is in large part because we keep our salaries lower. So in other words, we're able to supply ourselves with high quality drugs, high quality supplies, and also to get them there at the right time. It's interesting, when people leave MSF and they're working with other organizations, the largest thing that they miss, aside from the better salary and some other organization, is, wow, I certainly miss the logistics that I had when I was working with with MSF. So this is just some quick photos. Here we were in Afghanistan, again, to try and access some of these remote areas to work. Not so easy. This is the very next day, when we've now come out of that pass and we're now down in a valley and having to traverse rivers, and there's a huge chain pulling the Land Cruiser behind the Jeep here. It's fascinating. There we actually had to walk across the river because we were afraid that the truck wouldn't make it. So again, just some of the terrain and logistical challenges that we have. Security. We work in armed conflict. Insecurity is just a fact of life for the most part of where we work. However, that said, ensuring the safety and security of our teams is our first priority, full stop. If we can't ensure that it's safe enough to be working there, then we will not be able to work there. There's lots of things that we do just to try and guarantee as best as we can, because you shouldn't guarantee it for sure, but just all the different radios, as you can see here, and radio contact and satellite phones and curfews and emergency evacuations and all the policies and rules that we have to follow, and if you don't follow them, you're fired, all these kinds of things. So security is certainly something that we take extremely seriously. Interestingly though, insecurity is not the leading cause of death or injury to expats, and MSF is part of that as well. The number one risk actually is accident, with cars and vehicles and just road traffic accidents. I was a bit surprised to learn that. However, one of the problems that we have with insecurity is gaining access to be able to work competently in certain areas. And that's probably one of the bigger challenges that we've got going on these days is, especially when you look at the Syrias, the Iraqs, the Somalias, is trying to figure out how can we actually work in some of these locations safely and meaningfully. Because if we're not able to have, reasonably moderate quality programming, there's no point in being there. So anyway, the whole issue of security is something that we need to take very, very seriously. Health security is pretty important. Most of the projects that I worked in, I was responsible for our international team staff health. So it's all great until you get sick. So this is actually on that very first mission in South Sudan, which was just an incredible opportunity for me just to experience so many different things. And then I ended up getting a fever and headaches and became extremely weak, and I ended up collapsing, on the way back from the bathroom one time. So they had to kind of pick me up and give me some fluids through the IV line and throw me in a plane and send me off to Nairobi in Kenya. And they ended up admitting me to hospital for a week in Kenya, in Nairobi. And remember, I was mentioning too that in 20 years before, there had been viral hemorrhagic fever, Ebola, in that region. And so when I showed up, and I was pretty sick, with the physicians who were looking after me in the Nairobi hospital, they didn't know what I had. So, lots and lots of investigations. But the moment that they quarantined me, everything got really real. It's like, oh my gosh. Okay, now I'm afraid, in terms of what this all is. And in the end, a couple of different antibiotics, things got better. It's probably something rickettsial, sort of bacterial-like. But I was also a little bit nervous when they discharged me. I was thinking, well, what if they're wrong? I'm going to get on that plane and maybe I do have Ebola, and I'm going to, the headlines, aid worker brings Ebola into Canada and kills his whole family. I was a little bit nervous at that point, but anyway, it didn't work out that way. So, overall, from a programming, the medical operations perspective, a huge piece of what MSF does as well is all about speaking out. You can see here just this, medicine should not be a luxury. And so down here, the Access campaign. So when MSF received that Nobel Peace Prize back in 1999, that was a moment that actually sparked something more formal that we ended up calling the Access to Essential Medicines campaign. So for a couple of years before that, as I was mentioning with HIV positive patients who have AIDS, the need for certain drugs, antiretrovirals. The problem is that the cost of those at the time in the late 90s was like $10,000 US per person per year. The vast majority of the illness burden of HIV is certainly in the developing world. And there's no way any of those people are going to be able to afford $10,000 per person per year. Governments couldn't do it, and most of the individuals would not be able to do that. So there was this huge problem. It's like, here's where the disease is, and yet there's the treatment, and we can't match it. So for several years, it was a huge advocacy campaign, lots of actors. MSF was only one of them, involved in all this, lots of court battles, which were nasty, lots of lobbying at various levels. And so in the end, we were able to bring that price down from $10,000 US per person per year to $100 per person per year after all of this effort. So it was a huge success for MSF and all the other organizations and people that were working on that. There's been a bunch of other different campaigns that we've got, Ebola for months in that West African outbreak. MSF was just yelling at the World Health Organization and various governments and so on. It's like, we need help here. This is huge. We're here alone. We need extreme support, and we're not getting it. So we ended up training people. And I get it. A lot of other organizations, they just didn't have the capacity. They were scared. They'd never done it before. So we started these huge training programs to work on this. But there was a huge advocacy campaign, to try and drum up the support to at least believe that this is a problem. And it wasn't until the few cases entered into the US and Europe that, some of the Western powers finally started to actually admit that this was going to be something they needed to address. Medical care under fire. One of the problems that we have, we talk about the illness, diseases, and so on of the patients in a lot of the places that we work. One of the difficulties we're also facing is where the healthcare system is being targeted. The structures, the people, the staff, the patients, the vehicles, ambulances, and so on. One of the worst examples of all of this, and there's just been systematic bombing of the hospitals all throughout Syria, all throughout Yemen, some places in Iraq. And, we've been documenting this for a long time. In Afghanistan, there was a town called Kunduz, and this was back in 2015. And it's like 2 a.m, and there was an American heavily armed helicopter that just sat 50 yards off of our hospital and just for close to an hour just kept shelling the hospital, an MSF hospital. And there was, I think, somewhere in the mid-20s people, patients and staff, international staff, national staff who were killed as a result of all of this. And we've never been able to get a clear explanation of why this happened or any accountability around it. So these are just some of the things. We've started this huge campaign around medical care under fire, and the International Red Cross is doing the same thing to try and bring this up as, first of all, it's illegal. But second of all, it's just absolutely destroying the healthcare systems. Some of the other comments here, migration, the lot of headlines around the Mediterranean boat rescues and so on and so forth. But it's not just, all the migrants from, some of the African conflicts and Middle Eastern conflicts moving into Europe, but a lot of migration for security reasons and safety reasons, all throughout Asia and Latin America and so on and so forth. So again, we're just trying to highlight something along these lines. Well, the one that I forgot, where is everyone? As I was mentioning, for Ebola, for example, there was nobody else. So we ended up having to train people. A lot of other organizations, larger international humanitarian organizations, are just getting their hands and their feet out of the emergency response work. Because it's hard. It's hard to keep up that expertise. I get it. But that's also leaving us, rather exposed and, having to get into areas of structures and water and sanitation that historically we would not have done. But there's no one else to do it. So we're having to get into this. So it's part of the reason why we're having to grow in areas that we didn't necessarily want to be growing. And then of course, a lot of the, the neglected and forgotten conflicts. Lastly, I just wanted to mention just for a moment about the staff. MSF, to me, it's an idea. I think it's an incredible idea. But if it weren't for the people, the whole organization would be nothing. The national staff, the locally hired staff that we have, make up about 90% of all of our overall workforce. And I just wanted to show the slide. This is just in in Kailahun in the Ebola treatment center where I was working. And again, if you look, I think it was 24 of our staff in that Ebola outbreak. All of them were West African. So the sacrifices that our national staff, put forward to be able to work for MSF, it's incredible. But there's also a lot of lighter moments, and this is kind of what keeps us coming back. This is in Somalia, just with the team on the day that I was leaving, and so I got a whole bunch of gifts, and it was actually hard bringing bows and arrows across the border through customs and so on. But kind of were able to make it work, and just all the different friends that you make. And this is in Eastern Congo. ago, the going away party. So they put on this big skit, and they were mocking how I would walk and talk and carry my backpack and my glasses, and we're all laughing. And it was just great fun. And this is, food is everything. When I was running these projects myself, as long as I could guarantee all of my team, their own room, private room, hard, plus a warm meal. And if you can't, a warm shower, then, it doesn't matter how hard the work is. It doesn't matter if you're working 20 hours a day. I think we'll survive. So, here's one of those meals that we always tried to get. This was a chicken curry that we had to make. The only problem was that the first part of making the chicken curry was they actually had to catch the chicken first. Again, it was one of those experiences. So lastly, these are just some of the dilemmas that we face, as an international medical humanitarian organization. And from an operational perspective, as I mentioned, it's hard for us to access some of these highly insecure contexts that we work in. Climate change is certainly affecting us. It's driving a lot of the areas where we work, whether it's, extreme weather problems, with floods and who knows, the tsunamis getting in there, certainly the hurricanes, droughts, so there's certainly that impact on the kinds of places. Darfur, a lot of the whole Darfur conflict back in the 2000s was, again, just related to water scarcity and the movement of people to try and find the water to either farm or feed their herds. So when you get into climate change, it's sort of driving a lot of the responses that we have to do. But then, we also need to be looking into our own carbon footprint as an international organization. Urbanization, if you look, I can't remember exactly what the statistics are, but I think by 2050, 50% of the global population will be in megacities. The growth of megacities is huge. Cities of, 10 million people or more. There's going to be dozens of them. We're only now just kind of scratching the surface on trying to understand how do you work in a setting like that. We're used to working, like you see most of my slides, we're used to working in the rural areas and so on, just figure out how to set up an epidemic response or like a serious hospital situation in the middle of a highly crowded city, which has got its own power dynamics that you're going to have a really difficult time trying to figure out. The crime that happens, often the municipal government is just completely inadequate to look after the healthcare needs. So to figure out how to work in densely populated urban settings is something we're going to have to figure out because, a lot of the, the global health needs are probably going to end up in that direction, for us. Some of the medical bits, just around technology, and we certainly need to, sometimes I think that MSF, as advanced as it is in so many ways from a technological perspective, I find our uptake of the information, the evidence, based medicine that's out there and so on, we're a bit slow at times. So it's certainly some of the things that we need to start working on, but we're getting there. Drug-resistant TB and chronic non-communicable diseases. We've historically always been treating communicable diseases, and there's lots of that. But now that we work in what we call middle-income countries where conflict, especially with the whole Arab Spring and North Africa and the Middle East and all the conflicts that have broken out, we're ending up, looking after patients who are on dialysis. I'm used to treating malaria in the bush, and now we're having to figure out how to run a dialysis unit, where there's already significant medical communities who have been working there for forever. And now here come this organization who's going to tell you how to work. It doesn't work that way. So trying to figure out how to work alongside the physicians who are highly trained and have been there. They're just, in the middle of a conflict with, higher level medicine and more complicated medicine is certainly a challenge for us. In the epidemic response, as I said, in some of these urban settings and then, of course, things like antibiotic resistance and so on, whether it's HIV or malaria or diarrhea. It's just some of the things that we're trying to address. And, of course, all the funding and trying to find the people. The competition for human resources is huge. So I'm just going to end with a quote. And I think you guys all read that. This is one of, as I said, James Arbinsky, just a Canadian physician who accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of MSF, certainly one of our visionaries. Yeah. Thank you.
You're going to field your own questions, of course.
Yeah, happily. So if anybody has any questions. Yeah, sir.
First of all, thank you. That was a superb talk. It was great to learn about MSF in this kind of detail. I'm just curious, how do you interface with the Red Cross, and what do they do that you don't do? I just am puzzled because as a layperson, I would have immediately thought in terms of the Red Cross. You now have encouraged me, obviously, to go beyond that. But they still exist, they still function. What's your relationship with them?
Yeah, so first of all,
how do you handle dental care and how do you handle fatigue?
Dental care fatigue, yeah. So on the Red Cross piece, so the Red Cross, it's not a homogeneous organization. So you've got something called the International Federation for the Red Cross, which is like an umbrella overall, kind of loosely coordinating, that's probably not so loosely coordinating mechanism for all of the national Red Cross societies. It's Canadian Red Cross, American Red Cross, and I think there's probably like 150 different Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. So you get the International Federation for the Red Cross, which is overseeing all of those national bodies. So when we're in a country, we often end up working with the National Red Cross or National Red Crescent, just because they're motivated, they're organized, they're funded, and they've got some experience dealing with whatever it was that we were doing. So I remember in northern Nigeria, in a town called Kano, the huge town, 2 million people, cholera outbreak that happened, and so we were using all the Red Cross staff to run that center because we just couldn't find enough people to look after it. So there's that. There's the national societies, but then there's also something called the International Committee for the Red Cross. The International Committee for the Red Cross, ICRC. So that's actually how it all began. And that was back in 1864, Battle of Solferino, and Henri Dunant, a Swiss, he was an entrepreneurial fellow. So he was the one who saw this battle, unhappy with what was going on, wanted to look after the sick, did so, went home, started the whole International Red Cross, International Committee for the Red Cross. So they're based out of Geneva, obviously related to the whole International Federation and all the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, but they're a separate group. It's huge. They're the ones specifically who have been mandated by the United Nations to be kind of like the torchbearer for international humanitarian law. All right, so all the rules of war. So the Geneva Conventions, they're the ones who oversee whether or not that's implemented and all the mandates of the different international governments. So the International Red Cross, so that's kind of in a rough sense of what they are. They're historically the ones who have had fantastic war-wounded hospitals, unbelievable war-wounded hospitals. Sadly, they're also making a little bit of a decision to get away from that. Their operational footprint is getting a bit smaller, over the last 10 to 15 years. So getting back to your question about what's the relationship, it's great. We want more of the Red Cross and the International Red Cross in particular because of the areas where we work. The national societies will always be there. One of the reasons why there's a huge kinship between MSF and the International Committee for the Red Cross is that they're also humanitarian principle based. And interestingly, when I talk about the humanitarian principles, that whole concept was kind of clarified and expanded upon and documented by the International Red Cross. So when you look up, when you Google, all humanitarian principles, it's all International Red Cross documents that have all of this stuff. We just loved it and took it. So there's not that many organizations out there who try and guide their work based on the humanitarian principles, except for the International Red Cross and MSF. And all the other, large international medical humanitarian organizations or international humanitarian organizations are starting to get away from that a little bit. Getting away from the emergency response, like I mentioned, getting away from the direct provision of medical care, working through partners at a bit of an arm's length, getting into more, conflict prevention and conflict resolution and so on, just what we call multi-mandate organizations, the CARES and the Oxfams. Oxfam certainly heading into more of an advocacy direction, the International Medical, International Medical Corps, I think. So there's a bunch of them that are just starting to get away from what we were hoping they would still be involved in. But the International Red Cross is still their main raison d'etre, their main reason for being, still humanitarian principle based, working in zones of conflict, and that's where we are. So great relationship. And so when I talked about that medical care under fire, the destruction of the healthcare system, they were actually the ones, the International Red Cross is actually the ones who started that campaign. We just tried to tag along with it because they're doing such a great job and it's such a big issue. And we're getting our butts kicked. Like we're getting bombed and shot and kidnapped all the time too. So we had to do something. So dental care,
treat who you meet. You just deal with what you can. If dental fractures, nothing we can do. Dental caries. That's interesting. I remember in Baraka in Eastern Congo, wow, were their teeth clean? So we were just assuming there's got to be fluoride in the water naturally here, and just to try and support that. But in terms of specific, dental care, it's just basic stuff that we would offer. Fatigue and burnout, it's a huge issue. And so we just try and look out for each other, and we've got a lot of mental health support internally for our own staff, expat health and national staff health and so on and so forth. And you try and spot the warning signs of when it's getting too much. I remember in that project that I was in Eastern Congo in Baraka, by the end of it, I had a 10% mortality rate in the hospital, in the pediatrics ward. And so 1 in 10 of the children that I was looking after was dying. And from a Western perspective, you're talking 0.00001 mortality rate for X and Y and Z. I had a 10% mortality rate. And a lot of it is, if people show up in the first 48 hours and they die within the first 48 hours, they probably just showed up too late for whatever their illness was. But if people are dying after 48 hours, you got to wonder, is there something we missed? So you try and look into it a little bit. There came a point when it's I can't fill out these death audits anymore. There's just too many, especially kids dying right in front of me. And it feels like there's nothing I can do. And so in that specific mission, so I was there for 7 months for that second time, because we helped to open it for the first 3 weeks. The 7 months, I remember I was just getting angry and irritable and hated it and so on. And by the time I finally left the project, there's crazy stories too around leaving, because I wanted to take pictures, and yet the local commander found out that I was taking pictures of schools and stuff. What's wrong with taking a picture of a school? And so they confiscated my camera, so I had to kind of get the little chip out, put it in my pocket, and so I still have the photos. But I remember leaving 10 minutes in that vehicle after having left the project. All of a sudden, everything was gone. And I look back on it and wow, we did something incredible there. But while I was there for that last 6 weeks, 8 weeks, just dragging my tail everywhere. It's incredible. So that's, the fatigue, you try to look out for each other, and it's immense. It's huge and pretty rough. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Well, actually, we'll start at the Frontier. Is that okay? Yeah, man.
Thank you so very much.
Yeah, pleasure.
Really very inspiring and inspirational. And I think you give hope to everybody. You give hope to those who you go to help. And I think you also motivate them to see what difference they can make.
Yeah.
And Meta is always telling us, which I agree with, you can change the world. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true of every person, each in our own way. And those of us, for example, here, if we think we might not, because of physical disabilities, be able to really help people by going there, we can give money on a regular basis. And so I don't know if you have any other words of advice to us. Obviously, I'm going to up my contribution to Doctors Without Borders. But there are some things that we can do. So many people, they say they're suffering from depression or something like that. Mm-hmm. Nobody has a right to suffer from depression when there is so much that needs to be done. Agreed. And where we have the possibility of doing that. Yeah. I don't know if you want to have any comments about that, but I think that we all of us are in the business of changing the world. And we have no business not to be doing our share of it.
No, I agree. And just on that point, there's numerous different MSF websites, but there's an msf.ca. Probably should have put that up there. msf.ca is just the MSF in Canada website, and there's lots of information about the places that we work and how we work and what we do, and so some of the things that we're always interested in. And of course, we would not be able to do what we do without our donors. Full stop. I was talking about the independence piece. We are so fortunate to be able to make our own operational decisions. And that's completely dependent on the fact that we have a huge donor support, which is incredible. But, one of the things that we're always trying to do is to figure out, also how can, our donors or our people, our supporters, engage with MSF, young, older, if they're not able to go to the field to work. And on the website, there's certainly lots of, ideas and so on, because a lot of it too is just around spreading the word. And there's different campaigns that we're in the middle of and just trying to increase the visibility on issues X and Y and Z. And so all of that is found too on the website. So in terms of your comment about, anybody, helping, from an MSF specific perspective, there's certainly lots of opportunity in that regard. I remember I had this crazy opportunity. It was ridiculous. So MSF won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so Mikhail Gorbachev, former Russian president, he started a foundation whereby bringing together all the Nobel Peace Prize laureates for a summit. I think it was about 10 years ago now. So I was in Chicago representing MSF, on a panel. And it was addressing that question. What can one person do? Can one person change the world? Well, if you want it bad enough, you certainly can. And, and I was always just commenting. It was all high school students in the audience, like 1,200 high school students in the audience. And I was sitting there like beside FDW de Klerk, former prime minister of South Africa. It was like alongside Mandela to get rid of apartheid. And who else was there? Lech Walesa, the former president, I guess, of Poland, who kind of started all this. And I'm like, oh, God. Get a picture and prove that I'm here, and so on. And so my comment to the audience was, first of all, like, look in your own backyard. Whether it's your house, your family, what are the issues that you might be able to grapple with in your family, and then expand it, your neighborhood, your school, your job, your city, your country. There's certainly lots of things that you can look to get involved in right in your own backyard, without having to engage with an international organization like MSF. However, if you want to, of course, there's lots of opportunities there too. But that was my first, message to other people. Then the other thing was, it's always a two-way street. So this is one of the things, MSF and the whole humanitarian sector can be extremely paternalistic. We come in, we're the professionals. We know how to do this. So you're going to listen. And we go into all these countries, set up our projects, and we don't always listen properly. We do a needs assessment, maybe we don't do it well. We start a project, maybe we're not listening to the actual community. Maybe they're actually doing that already, way better than we ever could. They just need a bit of support. So, it's a two-way conversation always if you're looking to go and help others. So that's the other piece that I had mentioned. So yeah, in terms of helping out there, I agree. Anybody can get out there and do it. Depression, were you talking specifically just around what MSF is doing, or is that what you were getting at, or?
Sorry, my hearing is not so good.
When you were mentioning specifically around depression, was that, in terms of what MSF is doing to address depression in our projects or in the organization, or was it more just, in Canada, or?
I think she was saying nobody has a right to be depressed when there's so much work that we could be doing.
Yeah.
Isn't that what you want to say? Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And my wife's a psychiatrist, and so she's the one kind of looking after me all the time, and so on. So I agree completely. And and it's interesting too because so MSF, born in 1971, we only started actually having a serious discussion about, forget the countries we work in. We only started having a serious discussion about the organization and the mental health of our staff in the 90s. Forget psychiatry, forget depression. We were just talking about our international staff, that 10% of who was part of the organization and their mental health. We only started talking about that. And it was a battle to get that on the agenda inside the organization, big organization. Things don't change quickly. But now we're certainly talking a lot more about, beyond mental health, getting into psychiatry. And it's not just, obviously our staff, international and national staff, but it's the projects. Because that's one of the things, like I mentioned with the natural disasters, we're rarely there fast enough to be able to make a meaningful difference acutely. for some of the things that happen like within a few hours. But the follow-on effects are often mental health related. And so that's one of the areas where we've certainly grown, is trying to get into post-traumatic stress disorders and depression, anxiety, and so on. You know, for those instances in war, huge area that we're just scratching the surface in, trying to understand the cultural elements of it, you know, what might actually work for some of these mental illnesses. You know, people coming out of such horrific situations, what can we do on a one-off or two-off counseling basis? So we're just learning all of this, but we're certainly starting to dig a lot deeper into, you know, the whole issue of mental health. So it's something that we talk about, you know, in a healthy way, rather than saying, not important. Now we're talking about it in a way that, you know, we're looking to figure out what we can do to address it. So I agree with you completely. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
From the perspective of a parent who has a child that's considering on volunteering with your organization, I have primary concerns with security reasons, and you said as far as kidnappings and that, and you're going into countries that are notorious for making kidnapping big business, and they're targeting foreign aid workers especially. Realistically, what with your organization, I mean, what do you do about that problem, and is that a real risk? I know we don't hear about even a fraction of what actually happens over there. I mean, is that a concern from a parent's perspective? I mean, there is a high risk for that in certain countries, right?
Yeah.
And is the person going over well informed about those risks, and what do you do from a security standpoint to protect your workers when they're in the field?
Yeah, so it's a great question.
Could you sort of repeat it? I'm sure we didn't all hear it.
Yeah, so the question is, you know, for our staff who are heading overseas in a lot of the higher insecure contexts, I don't know where the camera is, I think it's over there. Can't see with all the light. You know, with the issue of kidnapping being a serious threat to safety, what does MSF do to try and mitigate that risk? Sadly, a lot of the places where we want to work, because the needs from a medical humanitarian perspective are so high, are the areas also where the risk to our teams is more significant. So that sucks, but that's also the reality. So we just have to figure it out. So, you know, if we're working in an area where there is a higher risk for potential kidnapping, but we're not picking up, you know, any information that leads us to think that MSF is targeted, then we just continue to do what we're doing. When we get to the moment where there is a targeted risk for the MSF project, within hours we're gone. Just evacuate. National staff, international staff. If we can maintain something on the ground there, great. But for the most part, the project closes, we're out.
So what happens when you're unsuccessful and that occurs?
Like if somebody is kidnapped? Well, we've got a whole crisis management team. Sadly, we've got too much experience with managing these situations. Like, we're not talking like it's by no means. I think if you look over the last 20 years, we're probably starting to get into double digits. You know, but it's still like one-off things. Some of them can last for like 3 years. Some of them are 3 weeks. Some of them are 3 hours. We've got a lot of experience, you know, with all of the headquarters in the processes. It's all set up. And sadly, we've just done it too many times, but we also know that we're going to have to keep doing it. So that we have a lot of experience with. And actually, people start coming to us to try and get some input into how to manage some of these things. So that's the first thing. So the second thing is then it's all about prevention. And for the most part, like if you look at security management, you know, you can either carry bigger guns, you know, from a deterrence perspective. And there's I think that Somalia, there was in Nigeria. I can't remember where, if we're doing it in Yemen, but there's only, I think, 3 or 4 countries where we actually have armed guards.
So you do have security of your own
Oh, huge. Oh, yeah. But there's only 3 or 4 contexts, 3 or 4 countries where we work, where we have armed guards. Every other place, and you know, we're working 70 countries. All the other countries are unarmed guards. So deterrence is one part of your security management. That's where the militaries go, bigger guns. The other part is just build higher walls and don't go on the other side of them. So avoidance. And, we've got walls, and, sometimes you've even got barbed wire on top of them, because crime is probably even a worse issue in most places than, pure insecurity from, threats like kidnapping and so on. But so there's the avoidance piece. So then you get into your curfews, and, you can't visit the markets and so on. And, we try and push that envelope, because the third part of security management, which I mentioned, is what we call acceptance, community acceptance. In other words, no one's ever going to know what's going on better than the people who have lived there forever. And if they want you there because you're providing a valuable service and you're looking after them, they're going to cover your back. So that's all the acceptance piece. And that's where historically and currently we put most of our attention, is trying to deepen and broaden the community acceptance. We've definitely got a lot of work to do on that, because it's just ongoing drinking tea with the locals. It's all about that. Just having conversations with as many people, carrying out the same conversation, giving the same message over and over and over again, as well as understanding what are your needs, so that we can address them in our health structures, and giving out a good product, giving good healthcare. So all of that, kind of combines into strengthening your community acceptance. And then the idea is that you will have somebody calling you, hours before something, may potentially blow up, saying, you guys got to move. So that's the third piece. And that's what the militaries historically, have not done. Bigger guns, bigger walls. They've not gone so far down the path of the acceptance, but that's where we've always put most of our time and effort. So that's how we try and address it at the field level. And like I said, we still have a lot of work to do, because, when in some of these places, it just really is almost too insecure to be there. So then the last piece that you mentioned, just around informed consent, that's huge. And, we've strengthened the forms that we get people to sign, the discussions that people have, even before they're actually hired. Like, you have to know where you're going, and you have to be comfortable with it. And from a security perspective, it starts with the individual. So there's what we call a line of management, the individual, and you got the team leader, the project coordinator in that small project. Then the next level up is what we call the head of mission, who's sitting in the capital. So that's sort of the third level, but in the same country. Next level up is sitting in one of the headquarters in Europe. They're what we call the desk managers. And then you've even got the general director of the whole headquarters above them. So there's this line of management. And at any point, if the general director or the desk manager or the head of mission or the project coordinator feels things are too insecure, too unsafe, they can just evacuate or tell you your behavior is unacceptable. You have to leave, and you have to listen. So that's in that direction. But also for the individual, if ever the individual feels too unsafe, we can never force them to stay. We will always facilitate them leaving. We'll listen.
Part of my question regarding what you were just recently talking about, as far as the support that's in place, I would imagine that people coming back from having worked in these areas are suffering an enormous amount of stress or burnout. Is there a support network for them to come back and reintegrate into society here once they've been in the field for a length of time? Yeah,
so for years and years, there's sort of two parts to that. There's the one that everybody gets, and that's it's formal but not professional. So everybody coming back, is a part of what we call the association. So it's just the group of current and historical people who have worked with the organization. And somebody will reach out to every single person who comes back to Canada, and it's the same for every country. Somebody will reach out who's an experienced field worker and phone them, meet them, and just hear, how did things go? But it's not professional. It's just, you got a lot of experience, there's training, lots of training given to these individuals, these sort of support workers, but it's not a professional mental health individual. If during the debriefing, when the individual comes back to Canada, and there are several debriefings, one of them is by a psychologist. Just a conversation that happens the moment you get back.
Where they're sent, they can come back with a lot of issues. Right?
For sure. Yeah, and usually the team, because you come back with all your evaluations, and so either you're open about what happened, or perhaps somebody else is open about some of the challenges that you experienced when you come back. And all of that is fed back into, confidentially, to the psychology staff that we have when they get back to the headquarters. So there's conversations that happen, and if there's any sense that you as an individual are perhaps suffering from a bit more anxiety or stress or what have you, burnout, then we get into all the professional supports that we offer for months and months and months after that. So all of that is and these have been programs that have been in play for years and years. And because it is such a huge issue. And then there's also times when, people will be coming back from certain contexts, which are so horrific that we will just tell them, look, I'm sorry, but you have to go and talk to this person because we know what you've gone through and you need it, even if you say no. So those are some of the other routes that we've also got. Yeah.
We've been long-term supporters.
Oh, thank you.
We've never heard a talk like this, and I think it's incredibly invaluable. But I don't know how often it's done, but I found it really learned so much and heard so
I'm
much.
glad.
Do you do a fair bit of meetings, or where is this particular between tape? Is it?
I think so. Yeah, or stream.
I can't understand the question. Can you repeat?
Yeah. So first of all, she's saying thank you, and I'm happy to be here. Absolutely, because I love Meta, and happy to help anytime. But then also, is this being taped somehow? And
yes, it will be available on the Science for Peace Facebook page. It is being it's being visible right there, right now. People watching it can see it right now, but it will stay there. And so, for the next week or 5 years, you can go to this Science for Peace page in Facebook, and you can see the video recording of this.
very good.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I wonder if that should be made known in your literature. You should tell people that they can go and see a video.
Yeah, we've no, for sure. And so to answer one of your first questions, like, have I done this before? Yeah, I've given a few talks before. I used to be the president of the board of directors of the whole MSF office here in Canada. So for 6 years, I gave a lot of talks, and it's fun. I must admit, I really do enjoy it. But I've been kind of with young kids. I've taken a bit of a back seat for the last few years, which has been great. But I'll probably ramp it up a little bit more in the near future if I can. But bottom line, the organization and the areas where we end up working, they speak for themselves. All I have to do is channel it a little bit. So it's I'm just lucky to be able to have an audience. Sorry?
You're full-time?
No, never been full-time. And so I work in the emergency department. I'm a full-time dad and a husband. And no, the MSF side of things, it was full-time for a couple of years. Because there was a point in my career when I was young and single, and it's like, do I want to stay here in Canada, just keep working and do periodic missions? Or do I want to dive into this more full-time? And I said, you know what? I'm young, stupid. So I think I will just dive in full-time. So I did it for a couple of years, just non back-to-back. And then it gets into the whole issue of, fatigue and, burnout. And, like I said, there was that one mission. Wow, it's just crazy by the end of it. And but yeah, there comes a time when you need to take a break. So then it's great to be able to just kind of talk a bit about it. So yeah.
So when conflict is happening, how does Médecins Sans Frontières get involved in that? What is the tipping point for their involvement? And is there a huge demand for involvement that you're not already there, but you wish you had the funds to be there?
Yeah, so I'll answer your last question first. Yes. So the question was just, how does the organization determine where they're going to work, and how do they get there, and are there other needs that we're just not meeting? So on that last piece, yeah, there's there's certain countries or contexts where, especially the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's our largest mission. If you look at the budget. one of our longest standing things. We could take everything we do in every single country and put it into the Congo, and we still wouldn't be, addressing the burden of health issues that are there. And we would love to, but again, you can't. There's only so much that you can do. So huge needs elsewhere. We just don't have the capacity, and the capacity is mostly people, to be able to do it. So getting into some of your first question then about how do we decide where we're going to go. So, every couple of years we have a strategic plan that's created, and, there's some overall, again, armed conflict and natural disasters and population displacements and, things along those lines, which are sort of the marquee, places where we will end up working. But we've also got, a little bit of an internal prioritization of the countries where we might want to work, because of reasons X, Y, and Z, as well as the kinds of things that we might wish to be doing. So with that framework that we've already got, we scan the news, and so that's part of it. But that's the headline problem, the headline crises that erupt like within a couple of days. We're lucky because we can actually start meaningful work on the ground probably within 48 hours. Few organizations who are able to do that. We're just fortunate enough to be able to. More often, it has to do with you're already in a country, because we're in 70 countries, and there's only 190 something, 195. We're already in a third of the countries globally. So there's probably a few others that we might like to be working in if we had a little bit more capacity. But even within the countries where we already work, it's the teams on the ground who have the closest connection with what's happening just over there or on the other side of the country, and they're the ones who hear things. And if based on the urgency and the needs that they're hearing, in discussion, as I talked about with the different higher ups, decisions might be made to go and do a quick what we call exploratory mission, where you'll just send 2 people in a vehicle for a couple of days to go and check it out and see actually what is the reality there. Maybe it's a lot worse and you really do need to go, or maybe it's all just rumor. So it's a lot of it just ends up being, hearing what's going on in the country or the region where you're working and just exploring it from the teams who are already there. Yeah.
One last question.
Yeah, Meta.
No, I'll go ahead with them. I just wanted to warn you, we need to wind up.
Yeah, we got 4 minutes. Any other questions? Sir?
Don't the Cubans have this kind of emergency response medical brigade or something? What do they do?
So very good.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question is there a Cuban medical brigade? Yes, very good. Not big enough. So I'm pretty sure that at one point they also ended up in the West African Ebola outbreak. And they've been in a number of situations, throughout the Caribbean, other parts of Latin America. Well-trained, very competent. And if they were bigger, they'd be even better. So we can work with them more. Again, it's that whole "where is everyone" concern that we've got. Yeah. Good.
That it?
3 minutes. Any last questions? Thank you, folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Absolutely wonderful. It's so inspiring and so beautiful to see people giving so much. It's really wonderful. Thank you so much, Bruce.
Yeah, thanks, man. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. And